The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. I met my girlfriend, let's call her Diana, when I was living in a bustling city. She worked at the same office as I did. We had known each other for like a year or two when we started dating. She would tell me stories about her hometown and the paranormal activities that occurred there. She was one of those people who are deeply interested in the paranormal. I did not believe her stories, because I didn't believe in paranormal stuff. She would always look so full of life whenever she talked about paranormal activities or stories she had heard from other people. After a few months since we started dating, she got a job at her hometown and moved there. I wanted to go there with her, but there were no job openings there. Not for the first few months at least. I applied for a few jobs in her town and finally was able to land one. I could not wait to see her again, because I hadn't seen her for months. I remember how Diana and her family welcomed me with open arms when I first entered the town. They fed me delicious food at her home, and I formed bonds with her family. In addition to her parents, she had a little sister who was the world to her. Her sister was called Lily. She was a shy, quiet little girl who barely spoke to anyone. Diana had told me how often Lily got sick, and how no doctors knew what was wrong with her. Diana would tell me how she and her family thinks that something else was causing Lily to get sick so often. On that day when her family welcomed me, her dad Daniel took me into his room. I wondered what he was trying to do. "Son, I heard that you're going to live in this town," Daniel said, his gaze fixed on me. I nodded in response to his question. "Then there are rules that you must follow." Daniel cleared his throat. "Do not fish at the pier past 12 a.m. in the night. Do not go into the woods past 9 p.m. And finally, do not go anywhere near the beach to the south at sunset. This final rule is one you must never break under any circumstances." I nodded, even though I did not believe him. I believed that everything must have a scientific explanation, and paranormal stuff are made up by people as a way to pass time or for entertainment. After that, I went back to dine with the rest of the family. The rest of the day went normal. Obviously, I couldn't stay at Diana's house, so I ended up renting a place close by to her place. We would go on dates occasionally as I got used to her town. Even though I did not believe her father Daniel had said, I avoided breaking the rules he mentioned out of respect for him. One day, when we were on a date at a local cafe, I brought up what her dad talked about with me, his list of rules. "Yeah," she said, "as long as you are not there at the times my dad mentioned, you're safe." I have to admit, the creepiness of those rules were getting to me. At first, I had thought that this was all a ploy by her dad to get me to break up with her. But seeing as how she herself validated his rules, I was not so sure anymore. As I grew more accustomed to the town, I would go to this beautiful beach to relax. I would use this swing in the woods that led to the beach. I could get a good view of the beach from there. There was always this one kind old lady, let's call her Matilda, who would talk to me whenever she saw me there. She would come there almost every evening to get wood to burn. I enjoyed those days. I enjoyed our conversations. She would tell me stories of the past, about the time when she was young, and at every day, when sunset draws near, she would hurry home after telling me that I should not stick around longer, even though I would have done so without her telling me. And one day, when I was chilling on a bench at the beach at evening, I fell asleep, because I had not slept well the previous night. I had a strange nightmare of an old man strangling me when I was on the bench and woke up. No one was there. It was quiet, with the sound of waves splashing. It was dark, with the clouds in the sky shaded with red. I looked at the time. It was already sunset. All of a sudden, I felt a chill run down my spine, like I was not alone. I quickly got back into the woods to go back home. As I was walking in the woods, I saw the old lady, the same one who would always talk to me in the distance. She was standing completely still, with her back turned. I did not notice it until I got close enough to her. She had no feet, and she was hovering above the ground. She turned around to look at me. Her eye sockets were empty, and she was grinning from ear to ear. It was not humanly possible. The minute that happened, I heard sounds of women laughing from all directions. They sounded hysterical. I covered my ears and turned my eyes away from her. And then, when I looked at where she was before, she was gone. I ran as fast as possible. The laughing voices were still there, echoing from all directions. Their volume did not change no matter how far I went. I covered my ears and made my way towards home. The people on the street shot me weird glances, as though they were staring at someone who went insane. As soon as I entered my house, the laughing voices stopped. It was as quiet as it had always been. I went into my room and plucked the courage to look through GHE window. Nothing was out of the ordinary. I looked at the sunset sky and wondered if this was going to continue. At that point, Daniel's warnings replayed in my head. Don't go anywhere near the South Beach at sunset. I wondered if this was the beach that he had talked about with me before. I was worried about what might come next. I stopped going to that beach, but the feeling was always there. I felt like something was watching me no matter where I went. Sometimes, I would feel someone touching my shoulder or pull my clothes lightly, and no one would be there when I would turn around to look. I did not tell Diana nor anyone about this. I believed that it was my burden, and my burden alone. I did not see the old woman either, for days. Ever since this happened, I used my free time to walk around town. I did not pay attention at the time, but I would never see the old woman when I walked around town. Many days passed this way, without further incident. One day, as I was going back home from work, I noticed the old lady standing there in the woods. She gestured me to come closer, but I was too afraid to go to her. She kept gesturing over and over, but I paid no heed to her. As I passed by her, I gave her a glance. She looked normal, like she usually does. I still could not get over how creepy she looked at sunset on the last day I saw her. Seeing how she looked normal, I told myself that whatever I saw and heard the other day must have been my imagination. As soon as I went up to her, she smiled. "Hey, Sonny," she said. "It's been a while since we last saw each other. How have you been doing?" "I have been fine, I guess," I answered. "Sonny, I have a present for you. Can you come with me?" the old lady eagerly asked. "Sure, I guess," I answered with a moment of hesitation. After gesturing me to follow her, she took me to her house in the town. It looked beautiful, as though it was built yesterday. It was filled with lights. Upon entering her house, I noticed that it was completely empty. "Do you live here alone?" I asked, my tone curious. "Yes, I have a few children, but they are all out of town," she answered. She led me into the living room and gestured me to wait. The house was well lit, with a lot of colorful, small lights. It looked as though the house was prepared for a party. Not too long after, she brought me a slice of chocolate cake. "Take a bite, Sonny," she said eagerly. Without wasting any time, I took a bite from the chocolate cake. But the minute I did that, it tasted like mud, and I instantly spat it out. The old lady was still there, observing me eagerly. She started laughing. "Sonny, take another bite," she said. "It tastes terrible," I said to her. She looked disappointed, and then she took the cake slice and went out of the living room. I was puzzled as to why the cake tasted like mud when it was clearly a chocolate cake. I still had the bad taste of it in my mouth. It was enough to make me feel extremely nauseous. I could not stay there any longer, so I went out of the house and rushed towards mine. I was getting weird looks from people on the street again, like I was an insane person. I could not stop to think about it at the time because I was too nauseous. As soon as I got back home, I vomited in my bathroom on the toilet. I did not look at it and flush the toilet. My whole body felt weak, as though I had a bad fever. I laid down on my bed to rest and fell asleep briefly. I woke up from my phone ringing. It was Diana calling me. I picked up. "Babe, are you okay?" Diana sounded worried. "Yeah, I'm okay. Just feeling a bit nauseous. That's all. I'm feeling better now," I said without thinking. "That's good," she said as though she did not believe me. I sensed that there was something odd. She was unusually silent and did not say anything for a while. "Babe, please tell me the truth," she said, with a serious tone. "What were you doing at the graveyard?" A chill went down my spine. I was genuinely puzzled at her words. "I did not go to any graveyard." "What?" "I didn't go to the graveyard since I came to this town," I said, genuinely confused. "Babe, a lot of people saw you at the graveyard eating dirt," she told me. "You left before anyone could intervene." Hearing this chilled me to my core. Was I losing my mind? Was I actually eating dirt in the graveyard? Or did people mistake me for someone else? Recalling what happened in the past, I came to the conclusion that what my girlfriend was telling the truth. We talked a bit more and she genuinely sounded worried. After that, she hung up the phone. On the next day, as I finished work, Daniel called me and asked me to come as soon as possible. So I went there. I knocked on the front door and Diana opened it. She looked worried. She gestured me to come in, so I went in. She led me into the living room and had me sit down on the couch. She sat right next to me and held my hand tight. A few moments later, Daniel entered the living room and sat down next to Diana. "So, Son," he started, "I hear that you did some questionable things in the graveyard." There was silence in the air. I hesitated to talk. "Well," Daniel broke the silence, "because this happened, you must have stayed on the South Beach at sunset." He was right. I nodded. His expression changed to a slightly angry one. "Son," he said, "I told you clearly, do not stay at the South Beach at sunset." I explained to him what had happened to me there in full detail, as well as everything that happened between me and the old lady. "I see. You've been seeing this old lady almost every evening?" Daniel asked. "Yes," I answered. "What did she say her name was?" Daniel asked. "Matilda," I answered. Daniel's eyes widened. I looked at Diana. She had the same reaction. There was silence for a few moments. "Son," Daniel replied, "Matilda died years ago. She is my mother, and she is Diana's grandmother." It shocked me to my core. I could not believe it. This meant that the old lady I was talking to all along was Diana's grandmother. Questions popped up in my head, one after the other. Why did the old lady lie about her children being far away if she was a ghost? Was she evil or something? So that's the shape it took. "Huh," Daniel said, as though he was talking to himself. "What do you mean?" I asked him. "That nasty thing. It's not real. She is not real. That is only one shape among many others that nasty thing takes," Daniel said. "Even my daughter Lily..." Daniel suddenly stopped. "It's okay, Dad," Diana reassured him, holding his hand. "My daughter Lily," Daniel continued. "That thing is tormenting her too. We only realized it recently." I was shocked. So the thing that has been causing Lily to get sick all the time was that thing. Almost right at that time, Lily entered the room. She looked at me and smiled. "Mr. Humpty likes you, Big Brother," Lily said to me. "Mr. Humpty wants Big Brother to hang out with him. Come." Before I could answer, Lily was pushed away by an unseen force, and she started struggling against something on the ground. It was as though something invisible was trying to strangle her. Before we could reach her, she stopped. She had passed out. Daniel took her in his arms as he cried. He was whispering something that I couldn't quite make out. After that, he went out of the room. I could see Diana covering her face with her hands, crying. I tried to console her the best I could. When she finally calmed down, I asked her to tell me everything. She told me what happened. They were having a barbecue in the evening. near the woods with their neighbors. Lily was playing with a few girls her age. When they took their eyes off Lily, she disappeared into the woods. They searched for her all over the place, only to find her standing still at the South Beach at sunset. She had been acting like that ever since that event. She would get frequently sick and would not be able to get out of the house. According to Diana, they were a safe distance away from the South Beach. She had no idea about how Lily went to the South Beach through the woods. There was no doubt in my head about it. Lily went through the same thing I did. Diana also told me that people who have been targeted by the entity see it in different forms. For me, it was in her grandmother's form. For Lily, it was someone divided by something else. Diana told me that someone was brutally murdered by some thugs at the South Beach at sunset nearly 40 years ago. I knew what she was getting at. It was his vengeful spirit that was haunting the South Beach. Obviously, it was a lot for me to take in. My entire world has changed within a span of a few days. Above all, I knew that whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with me. Deep in my heart, I wished that that thing would leave me alone. As much as I did not want to believe that it was real, I did. I wondered why others were fine, even though they went to the South Beach at sunset. Why Lily? To this day, I'll never know. Diana didn't seem to have an answer either. In the following days, the activity intensified. I would hear distant laughing, talking nearly every time I went outside. Activity started happening everywhere except my home. The other day, my coffee mug was pushed by an unseen force, breaking it to pieces when it hit the floor. Another time, I would see shadow figures moving at humanly impossible speeds, so I reduced the time I spent outside. My contact with Diana was very limited. I could not pick up her calls. Even though I knew she was worried, my mind was just too occupied with the activity that was happening to me. The activity at my workplace worsened as I stopped going outside except when I had to work. The shadow figures I would see in my workplace evolved into unnatural entities. One particular day, as I was working past the normal hours, without anyone else but me, I caught something in the corner of my eye. In a cubicle in the same row as mine was a shadow-like face with no features except for its gigantic eye. Only half of its face was visible. I jolted. As if noticing my movement, it put its head back in the cubicle it was in. It was only there for a moment. I did not take my eyes off the cubicle it was in and went up to that cubicle. To my surprise, the cubicle was empty. I was too scared at that point, so I was about to go home. As I reached the exit, I saw a creature, the same creature from before, with its gigantic eyes. This time, its face was visible. It was a distorted face. Its body was like a bodybuilder's. It had 8 legs that on its human-like torso. It looked very much like a spider. Upon seeing it, I heard hysterical women laughing from all directions. At least, that is the thing I remember before fainting. On early morning the next day, I woke up in the graveyard without knowing how I went there. I looked at the visible parts of the street. There was no one around. Figures since it was early morning after all. I quickly hurried towards my house, my body aching with pain. After reaching my house, I decided to call someone, anyone who can help me. I reached for my phone in my pockets, only to realize that it was gone. I was too scared to be outside, so I couldn't afford to go back and search for my phone. So I went inside my house and took a shower. The weight that I had felt the whole time was gone as soon as I entered my room. That was when I noticed the wounds on my body. There were scratches and bruises everywhere. What happened to me last night? I wondered. Still, the image of the spider-like creature lingered in my head. Those gigantic eyes, the distorted face. If possible, I never wanted to see the creature again. After showering, I lay on the bed, thinking. Not too long after, I heard knocks on the door of my room. I opened the door. It was Diana. She looked very worried and sad. She asked me to tell her everything about what has been happening to me. So I did. She called her dad and told him the whole story. She and her dad offered to help me with this situation, and I accepted gratefully. I had heard that Lily went through this similar experience, and with the help of some exorcists, It is not as intense anymore. Ever since that, I haven't gotten out of my house much. I am currently taking leave from work. Thank God for vacation leave. I've seen a few exorcists, but my condition hasn't improved. Every time I go out of my house, I see that spider-like creature in the shadows, looking at me. Sometimes it disappears. Other times it runs towards me with inhuman levels of speed, and I would faint, only to wake up with scratches all over my body. Oh, and I also figured out that staying in my house keeps it away. So I am spending more and more time in my house. Diana is helping me with food and errands. Thank God I have such a wonderful girlfriend like her. I'm too scared to go outside anymore. At the same time, I am wishing to be rid of this curse, ghost, spider, or whatever it is. So I'll remain in my safe haven until exorcists are able to get rid of this entity. Back in the year 2000, I used to work at a comic book store. This was at the height of Pokemania, so the place had morphed into a shrine to all things Pikachu, and the store was constantly annexed with screeching children. Life was loud and chaotic and filled with concerned parents. Before every shift, I'd hotbox in my car so that I could stay mellow during the after-school rush. Being 19 and stoned, I'd do my best to avoid any semblance of responsibility and left all the heavy lifting to whoever was on shift with me. For about a month and a half, I got paid to stand around the store and stare off into the ether. With enough complaints from my co-workers, however, a regional manager was summoned to check on the quality of customer service. The moment I walked into the store, I was chastised for coming in late and not looking presentable. The manager was the splitting image of my middle school math teacher, smelled like a dentist's office and clearly had it out for me. She took notes on everything I did and would ask all these super patronizing questions that made me sound like an idiot. Mandy, my co-worker, who was definitely responsible for the majority of the complaints about me, was barely containing her joy. Every time the manager chastised me, Mandy kept grinning this stupid grin that was making it hard for me to keep my cool. In order to look busy and mainly to get away from Mandy, I excused myself to go speak with the customers. That's how I met Professor Henry Willow. Not being a child or a parent, Willow stuck out of the crowd of our usual clientele. I had seen him in the store a couple times before. Small, balding dude in a dress shirt and spectacles. He looked like he was killing time before catching the bus to adult math camp. Willow never bought anything. Every time he'd pop into the store, he would just stare up at the big poster of the 151 Pokemon in complete silence. Sometimes he'd pick up a pack of stickers or trading cards and examine it, but it never held his attention for long. He'd just stare up at that poster with a keen, scientific interest, and then, when he was satiated with the cartoon monsters, he would leave the store. I wasn't certain if I could make the strange man buy anything, but at that moment I was absolutely sure I shouldn't try talking to a child in front of the stern manager lady. In as casual a way as I could muster in my crispy state, I asked the man if he needed any help. At first, Willow just stared at me as if I had arrived from another planet. It was only once his stare had sufficiently weirded me out that he started to speak. His voice was low and he seemed to choose every word with the utmost caution. It quickly became obvious that the man was batshit crazy. Willow told me how he had seen the creatures on the posters before. In his dreams, for well over a decade, he had seen a world filled with Pokemon of flesh and blood. The longer the spectacled man spoke, the more he was getting worked up. I feared a scene, so, to calm him down, I asked Willow if he wanted to buy anything. My question seemed to pull him back from whatever internal wonderland he was traveling. With a hint of embarrassment, he nodded. This was a store. After all, he said. It would be impolite to not make a purchase, he said. I expected the man to grab a pack of trading cards and call it a day, but Willow kept picking away at the shelves until he had a sizable purchase of stickers, cards and books. He picked out the items with a sort of guilt, as if he was paying penance to be in the presence of all these cartoon monsters. Both the manager and Mandy seemed to be in awe of how I got the strange man to buy so much stuff. I, of course, knew my sales skills had nothing to do with the purchase, but I sure as hell pretended that they did. When I rang Willow up, I told him I'd be happy to answer any other questions he had about Pokemon if he ever came back to the store. This wiped the guilt off his face. With a thankful smile, he told me he'd be back soon. I didn't get fired that day. Far from it. In fact, from the day I met Professor Willow, I became the top salesman in the branch. Every day I sold to a market of one, but that singular customer had deep pockets. By the end of the month, Willow owned one of just about every piece of Pokemon merch we carried. He bought all the books and sticker collections and video games. Willow even bought 2 of the overpriced Game Boy Colors and a Game Link so that he could catch all the Pokemon across the different versions of the game. The man was obsessed in a way I had never seen before. He snagged up every new piece of merch like it was a priceless collector's item. But more importantly, he asked questions. He asked very specific questions. Not only was Willow interested in the origins of the Pokemon themselves, he also wanted to know more about the society in which they existed. Who financed the Pokemon hospitals? Where did the profits from the Pokemarts go? Could the fact that all the police officers and nurses were related point to some sort of a monarchical ruling power? With every visit, Henry Willow filled my stoned head with all sorts of theoretical questions about the Pokemon universe. Back then, I didn't make much of those questions. They were strange, sure, but the scientist was keeping me at the top of the regional sales charts and got Mandy to seethe with jealousy whenever she was on shift. Willow was generally calm. With tranquil eloquence, the scientist could philosophize about the nature of Pokemon, evolution, or the power hierarchies of the various criminal organizations in the Kanto region. It is only once the topic of the Elite Four and the Pokemon League Championships came up that his voice tensed up. Out of all things Pokemon, it was the championship that seemed to fascinate him the most. He wanted to understand why so much resources and attention were devoted to the Pokemon gyms. He wanted to know how involved the ruling class was in organizing the tournament and what happened to the champions once they had won or, God forbid, lost. Where his voice was calm and measured through most of our topics. The question of the Pokemon Championship would make his words shiver with obsession. I did not understand the man's fascination, but I did not question it. I would simply let him ramble about the implications of a regional Pokemon Championship and then happily ring up whatever merch he snagged off the shelves. Willow would ask me questions, but he seldom gave me time to answer. I wasn't a particular Pokemon expert, so it's not like I had much to add to the conversation. To Willow, I presume, I was more of a bouncing board for his ideas, a friendly face that could be paid at regular intervals to listen and nod and assure the man that there is nothing unsettling about his obsession. Willow was definitely strange, but I didn't spend too much time psychoanalyzing him. My lack of curiosity was mainly tied to the fact that I was stoned out of my mind, but Willow also didn't seem to warrant any caution. He was short and lanky and generally timid. He seemed harmless. That was until I suggested a reason for the Pokemon Championship. I had channel surfed past a documentary about human civilization and sports the night prior, and spent a good chunk of my shift thinking about it. When Willow came in for his usual shopping binge and started talking about the Pokemon League, I thought I would tell him what I learned from the documentary. Maybe the Pokemon Championship is a way for the community to celebrate shared ideals and unite all of the Kanto region, I said. I didn't think my comment was particularly insightful. I thought it was just an innocent observation about a hypothetical situation. My comment, however, set Willow off. With madness blazing behind his spectacles, Willow started to ramble. I was right. Apparently, the Pokemon Championship was being used to unite the whole island into a single set of values. The Pokemon Championship was being used to make it easier to rule over the Kanto region. Willow's celebration of finally finding the reasoning behind the fictional universe was exceedingly loud. Even for the after-school rush, both parents and children quickly shifted their attention from the pictures of cartoon monsters to the raving scientist in the center of the store. Willow was loud, But it wasn't just his volume that was bothersome. The way he talked about the Pokemon universe was wholly disconnected from the friendly nature of the cartoon. Willow spoke about a world filled with incomprehensible monsters, about a life suffered in the husk of the old world, about a terrible existence which required a strong hand to keep order. Willow spoke about the world of Pokemon in apocalyptic terms, which made everyone around him uncomfortable. Worst yet, however, the scientist spoke about this broken, ravaged world as an inevitability. Willow yelled about the coming end of days and how the globe would be filled with incomprehensible monstrosities that would have to be tamed through technology. I tried quieting him down, and eventually I did, but the damage had been done. Just as I calmed Willow down to speaking volume, 2 police officers entered the store. Without any hesitation, Mandy pointed out the man to the cops and insisted he be trespassed immediately. I tried sticking up for Professor Willow, but the scattering of parents in the store quickly took Mandy's side. The man was, apparently, dangerous. He, apparently, had no business being around children. I put up a token resistance to the idea of the trespass, but in the end, it was my signature that ended up on the paperwork. I was a bit too stoned and had a few too many grams in my glove box to argue with the cops. Without much ceremony, Willow apologized and promised to never return to the store. Years later, I can still see his sad, teary eyes as he looked back at the shelves of Pokemon merchandise. Years later, I can still see Mandy's stupid, crooked grin. Willow's absence was quickly reflected in my sales figures. Within 2 weeks, the stern regional manager had returned, with me having been the previous top seller in the store. She was much nicer at the start of her visit, with no big spender to save me. However, I was quickly revealed to not be a very good employee. By the time the manager's visit was done, I was certain that I wouldn't hold the job past the end of the week. I left the store that day, wondering about what other gigs I was qualified for that wouldn't mind me being a bit blazed on the job. It's then, as I was heading to my car, that I met Professor Henry Willow once more. He approached me in the parking lot, profusely apologizing. It wasn't until I accepted his apologies at least 3 times that he finally calmed. Once he was sure I held no grudge against him, he revealed the true nature of his interest in the world of Pokemon. He had seen similar creatures in his dreams and visions. That was true. What he never told me, however, was that he was a scientist specializing in genetic manipulation. He had seen unnatural creatures in his dreams, yet in accordance to the dreams, he brought those creatures into reality. The manager's visit had definitely soured my mood, but listening to the lanky man explain how he could create Pokemon, or hybrids, as he called them, cheered me up. I thought he was kidding, so I laughed. Professor Willow, however, found little humor in his subject of study. He claimed that he had been working for months on developing these hybrids and that he had kept some of his samples in a storage facility not far from the comic book store. Willow had worked independently for all of his career, but recently he had come across like-minded scientists out east. He offered to take me to his rented lot at the storage facility. He offered to prove to me that his hybrids were real. The prospect of seeing Pokemon in the flesh was alluring enough, and I was about to accept. Yet before I could agree to join him, the scientist produced Polaroid photographs of these supposed hybrids. He must have pressed around 20 of those flimsy photographs into my hands, but I did not see more than 5. They were far too disturbing. Merely looking at them made my stomach churn, even though I was looking at mere photographs. The freshly sown sweat across my back made me certain I was looking at something patently against the laws of nature. I have done my best to forget what I had seen on those Polaroids, but I recall a strange 6-legged cat-like creature covered in thick green vines. I remember an amorphous glob of grey flesh covered in a symphony of bug eyes that seemed to be hiding beneath a layer of shrubbery. I remember a dog, an almost regular-looking dog, engulfed in fire with hot magma dripping from his cheery maw. I rejected Professor Willow's offer to see his hybrids that night, and I do not regret my decision. As lanky and harmless as the man seemed, there was something patently wrong with the creatures he had developed. God knows what would have happened to me had I followed the mad scientist to his storage space that night. It's been well over 2 decades since this all happened, and I try not to think about it. Yet, every once in a while, I find myself wondering whatever became of Professor Willow. I find myself replaying the events of that evening in my head and trying to ascertain how real the creatures that he showed me were. With the pandemic and the wars and the constant nuclear saber rattling over the past couple of years, I find myself wondering how likely it is that Professor Willow's visions of the future will come to pass. I suppose my grandfather had eccentric tastes. The place he called home near the end of his life was a somewhat disturbing property that would surely freak out most people. It was a former insane asylum. Despite its off-putting past, he talked about it like it was the most luxurious mansion you could imagine, instead of being creeped out by it. He was proud to own such a historic old building. He bought it for a very good price, but spent quite a bit on restorations. When he passed away, I was stunned to discover that he left the building to me. A few members of the family were a bit insulted that he gave it to me over them, but most were so unsettled by the place that they didn't mind. I guess I really was his favorite granddaughter. I drove up one day to take a look at the place, tour the building, and decide what I was going to do about the fact that it had recently come into my ownership. At first, I thought there was no way I'd ever actually move in. Arriving at the property, I was confronted with the sandstone monstrosity. The building was tall, towering over the landscape, with ornate windows and Gothic architecture. There was a circular water fountain in front and a large clock tower at the entrance. Inside, there were several long and empty hallways. My grandfather had renovated the opening interior room into a living room and had rearranged things quite a bit. He had changed the doctors' and nurses' areas into his lavish bedroom and guest rooms. The kitchen was fully redesigned with expensive granite countertops. In one room there was even a pool hall. He had really turned this grim asylum into his own personal manor. I was somewhat impressed. At the time, I still lived in a cramped apartment, so this was certainly an upgrade as far as space was concerned. I was pretty hesitant, but eventually I decided to sell my apartment and move in. It might be a bit creepy, but it was much nicer than the place I'd been staying, and there was no way I could pass up on all that space. It's not wise to look a gift horse in the mouth, I suppose. It took some time to get used to it, and heating the place was a nightmare. Whenever I'd walk through the hallways, it'd be freezing cold. However, the bedrooms and other rooms I could heat with fireplaces and heaters. After a while, I stopped seeing it as an asylum and saw it more and more as just a nice house that my loving grandfather had graciously given to me. I was appreciative. This next part is a bit difficult to describe, but I guess it's relevant. I've had mental health issues all my life, on and off. They tend to get worse during periods of high stress, and shortly after my move, I started having a lot of issues at my job and with a few of my relationships. I became very paranoid as a result. I was convinced that someone was poisoning my food. Even when I was self-aware enough to know that it wasn't true, it still bothered me and kept me from eating for several days. I felt I was having some sort of psychotic breakdown. Eventually, I sought psychiatric help, and after much assessment, I was diagnosed with schizophrenia. I didn't have any auditory or visual hallucinations, and with the aid of therapy and medication, I was able to keep my symptoms in check and manage it. The irony of living in a former insane asylum at the time wasn't lost on me. My friends morbidly joked that maybe the building was what did it somehow, but of course, I'd had a history of such mental health problems all throughout my life. Thankfully, this was the 21st century, and I was able to receive proper treatment, unlike many of the poor folks who lived their lives in the former asylum that I then called home. It was also a less taboo subject, something to be discussed more openly, instead of locked away behind the gates of hellscapes like an insane asylum. Patients were once stored away from society like a dirty secret and subjected to what would now be seen as horrible medicalized mistreatment. This grim history was all around me and only drove home the point for me what progress we had made as a society and how grateful I was for it. Then something most peculiar happened. One night I was heading to the kitchen to get a midnight snack. I had a blanket wrapped around me while traveling through the cold hallways. While making my way there, I noticed unsettling movement in the distance. The hallway I was in had tall wooden doors along either side, with each one leading to a small room that the patients once stayed in. When I looked towards the source of the noise, I saw a human figure walking out of an open door. The figure moved down the hallway before disappearing through another open door further down. The figure was as plain as day, a person standing there, like you or me, not transparent like a spectre in a movie. It was an eerie woman wearing an old-fashioned white nurse outfit. She looked like something out of an old black and white photo. I felt the threatening feeling that a mysterious stranger was in my house. I stopped dead in my tracks. The mind is a weird thing and can play tricks on you. I would know that more than most. At first, I took what I was seeing at face value, but when I thought more about it, I wondered if it could be a product of my mental illness. I'd never had visual hallucinations before, and I'd been taking my medicine. Could I really be seeing this? I thought. Cautiously, I took a few steps forward in the cold, dark corridor. As if on cue, the nurse emerged from the door at the end of the long hallway. This time, however, she turned and faced towards me, staring blankly. Her piercing dark eyes gazed into me. This made my skin crawl. The woman's uniform was a white dress, shoes, and hat. Her skin was ghostly pale. Her short hair was dark brunette. She looked at me for quite a while before a wicked smile began to slowly appear on her face. We both stood transfixed, staring at one another for a moment. Something about the way she was looking at me was very sinister and intimidating. She appeared to be holding an odd, shiny silver medical instrument in her hand, but I couldn't see what it was. The nurse then began walking towards me. In a panic, I ran back into my room and slammed the door. I stayed awake all night. There was no way I was sleeping after that. I waited for daylight. In the morning, I nervously peered out the door but saw nothing. It took hours to gain the courage to investigate the hallway in the daylight, only to find absolutely nothing. No one was there. After that horrible night, I started storing snacks in my room to avoid the empty hallways where I saw the nurse. I still wasn't sure what she was. Given the history of the building, I thought she might be a ghost. But with my recent mental health crisis, there's no way I could be sure. One morning, I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom mirror, trying not to think about what I'd been going through. I suddenly got the uncomfortable feeling that I was being watched. In the mirror, I saw the haunting figure gradually appear behind me out of nothing. With sudden alarm, I dropped my toothbrush and turned around to look, but she was gone. That's when I became really convinced that what I was seeing was a spirit of some kind. But that conviction was hard to hold on to as the days went by. I couldn't trust my own mind to be giving me accurate information on what I was seeing. I just didn't know if this was part of my condition somehow worsening or not. I wasn't sure which answer was more frightening, that my illness now resulted in vivid hallucinations, or that an asylum spirit was pursuing me. Then I started seeing her during the daytime more and more. Sometimes it'd be just for a moment or out of the corner of my eye. Other times I'd see the ghostly nurse going in and out of rooms doing her busy work. She always seemed to catch me off guard. I started closing all the doors, but somehow I'd find them inexplicably open again. The door physically moved. That couldn't be the result of a mental health issue, I thought. Then again, maybe I didn't actually close those doors, but just tricked myself into believing I did. Sometimes late at night when I was getting ready for bed, I'd hear the sound of her nurse shoes walking on the tile flooring out in the hallway. I'd shudder as she drew closer and closer. If she was a spirit, I wondered what she wanted from me. After weeks of being plagued by her mysterious and threatening presence, I decided I had to see my doctor and tell him about this. I told him that I'd been experiencing what I believed to be visual hallucinations. He increased the dosage of my medication in hopes that that would help. It didn't. I continued to see the ghostly woman in the hallways or throughout the building as I tried to focus on my daily life. I'd see her again and again. She just wouldn't go away. Nothing could make her leave. I'd yell out to her in empty rooms, asking her what she wanted from me or pleading with her to please stop and leave me alone in peace. She made no reply. Then one night, as I was sleeping, I grew restless and began to toss and turn. Suddenly, I found myself awake in the dark room. My eyes strained in the darkness until I could make out what I was seeing. My bedroom door, which I had locked, was wide open. The nurse was standing at the foot of my bed looking at me as if I was a patient in her care. Terrified, I screamed, threw the blankets off of me, and ran out of the room. I made my way alone through the chilly hallways to the kitchen and flicked the light on. I stayed in the kitchen all night, guarding the door and looking around the room, nervously waiting for her to spontaneously appear somewhere. I knew I locked that door, with my dosage already increased. Any notion that this was a product of my mental illness went right out the window for me. I needed to research the property more to see if there was any way to figure out what I was dealing with. I knew my grandfather had a binder of information he'd collected on the old asylum. He'd mentioned it to me before. I just needed to find it. I spent the day digging through storage until I finally uncovered it in an old tote at the very bottom of a stack of cardboard boxes. The binder was full of newspaper clippings and documents about the place, from the time it was being built until the time it was closed down and sold. There were even letters and correspondence between staff within its pages. I learned about the grisly history of the asylum and about the poor treatment and dehumanization of the patients there. In order to calm patients down, sometimes they'd put them in ice baths, which were tubs filled with ice to get them to calm down. They also did electroshock therapy on supposedly unruly patients. But the worst of all was the many horrific transorbital lobotomies, which were done with tools resembling an ice pick and hammer. Lobotomies were once considered a helpful form of treatment for various mental illnesses, including schizophrenia, OCD, depression, anxiety, and violent outbursts. Sometimes the patient's relatives just simply didn't want to deal with them for whatever reason, and so they had them committed or lobotomized. Anyone deemed abnormal was at risk. Sometimes this was an easy way for a husband to get rid of his former wife. The procedure essentially resulted in permanent brain damage to the prefrontal cortex and left the patient as a zombified shell of their former self. A steel ice pick was stabbed just below the eyelid into the thin bone inside the eye socket. The end of the long silver ice pick would then be struck with a small medical hammer until the pick cut into the brain tissue. The pick was then moved around from side to side until it severed the frontal lobe's connection to the thalamus. Their personality, their self, and their ability to make rational decisions were forever destroyed. Sometimes the patients were wide awake during these procedures, and sometimes they died from brain bleeding. The patients were left with vacant expressions and severely blunted or reduced emotions. The doctors found them to be more obedient and claimed to have fewer issues from them. Lobotomies continued in the medical field until around the late 1960s. It was perhaps the worst thing you could do to someone, like killing them but without killing them. I soon learned there was a nurse there who was legendary for the amount of lobotomies she'd given. Her name was Amelia, and if the letters are to be believed, she was not the nicest of people. I was horrified when I turned the page and was met with a photo of the very spectre that had been haunting me, standing outside on the building's front steps with the other nurses. Looking into her dark, hateful eyes, I was sure it was her. Every detail matched. The spirit I'd encountered was the cruel nurse Amelia, who worked here in the early part of the 20th century. Not wanting to be alone or in the building at all after reading that, I asked a close friend of mine if I could come over to her place. I explained some of what I was going through to the extent that I could without seeming too off-kilter. Being a true friend, she agreed that I could stay over for tonight so I wouldn't be so frightened. I wondered how expensive a long hotel stay would be until I could find somewhere else to live. I arrived at her house and we talked in the living room for a while. I showed her the binder and told her about what I was experiencing. It was nice to have someone to talk to, and she made me feel much more comfortable. Getting out of that depressing asylum certainly put me in better spirits as well. Saying all of the story out loud to another person, I began to doubt myself a bit. It all sounded too unbelievable to be true. Suddenly, my friend asked, "Do you hear that?" I listened closely. We both then heard the sound of shoes on hard tiling. It was coming from the hallway leading to my friend's bedroom. She got up to investigate, and I cautiously followed close behind her. Staring down the hallway, we both saw the ghostly figure of a dark-haired nurse. "You see what I see, right?" I asked. My friend, unable to form words, nodded. In the nurse's hands, she held a silver ice pick and hammer. Nurse Amelia just looked at me and smiled a foreboding smile. In that moment, I saw that my worst fears were justified, and there was no longer any ambiguity. I knew then what her intentions were for me, and I knew that I wouldn't be rid of her. She must have overheard me mention something about my diagnosis while I was living in the former asylum. She knew about my condition, and she intended to use her tools to fix it, the old-fashioned way. My aunt was dying. I knew she didn't have long to live, so I traveled out to see her. My boyfriend came along too to give his respects. He was actually already in the area for another reason. It may sound silly to some, but his major hobby is researching Sasquatch, and there had been a few supposed reports in the area that my aunt lived in. We entered the small home to see a few of my other family members already there in the living room. My mother and father were there and understandably heartbroken. My mother looked especially exhausted and was clutching her rosary beads for comfort. My boyfriend and I entered my aunt's bedroom. She looked incredibly weak lying there. My aunt and I never saw eye to eye on many things. She was very devoutly Protestant, not Catholic like my mother. Meanwhile, I was a neo-pagan who worshipped an eclectic variety of ancient gods and goddesses. We were an odd family, to say the least. I didn't know what to say to my aunt, so we made awkward small talk while ignoring the elephant in the room. My boyfriend, lacking social graces, cut in and asked if she'd heard of the recent Sasquatch sightings reported from the nearby forest. I elbowed him as if to say, "Not now." To my surprise, my aunt appeared interested and replied, "Well, I don't know about Sasquatch, but I did have my own mysterious encounter in those hollows. When I was a little girl, I was lost in those woods, and an inexplicable white orb of light suddenly appeared. I followed it, and it guided me back home. I knew it had to be the Holy Spirit." My mother, apparently listening in, appeared in the doorway. "It's true, I saw it myself in the old dark hollow," she added. I thought about it for a moment. It sounded to me a lot like the will-o-wisp in old Celtic lore. "Are you sure it wasn't some kind of fairy activity?" I asked. My mother and aunt looked at me disapprovingly. "There are no such things. Those are all demons in disguise, and they'd never do anything good. This was surely the Holy Spirit or some kind of miracle from the Lord. There is only one God. Anything else is deception," my mother lectured. "How do you tell the difference?" I retorted. "You just do. You use your discernment," she replied. My boyfriend cut in again to add that he had all sorts of odd experiences in the woods looking for Sasquatch. "I've heard knocking sounds on trees, seen glowing eyes in the distance, and once I swear I even saw a man-sized hair-covered thing dart out from behind a tree and disappear into the foliage." My mother and aunt didn't seem very impressed by that. The conversation changed topics from there. We decided to stay the night at my aunt's place along with my mother to take care of her. As we got ready for bed, I couldn't stop thinking about that mysterious light they saw in the forest that had protected my aunt all those years ago. I was sure it must have been some sort of will-o-wisp or forest spirit. I had the idea to go out to the dark hollow at night with some kind of offering to leave out there, something sweet that the Fae would like, such as cakes, berries, or libations. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, I snuck out with a small jar of blueberries and a bottle of wine in hand. I journeyed out into the heart of the forest, where I found a nice spot to make an offering. While pouring out the berries and wine onto the ground beneath a tall old tree, I asked for any spirit dwelling in this forest to help me or guide me to the truth that I couldn't see. I sat a day in silence and asked my questions internally. I felt an odd, almost electrical feeling around me, and I could pick up the smell of ozone throughout the forest as if after a lightning storm. Why does mankind struggle with the spiritual realm? I thought. How can there be so many interpretations for something as simple as a light in the darkness? I know that faith gives people a sense of comfort, but what's really behind it all? I questioned. I just needed to know. Suddenly, I felt a strange humming in my brain. Through the scraggly trees, I saw a light, dim and distant at first, that grew closer and brighter. Soon the white orb was hovering in front of me, before my very eyes. I watched the light shift and change, ultimately transforming into a large, hairy creature. There stood proudly an 8-foot-tall Sasquatch where the orb had once hovered. I was amazed at what I just witnessed, but this was only the beginning. To my utter confoundment, I watched as the Sasquatch began to inexplicably make the sign of the cross. He lifted his long, hair-covered arm to his forehead, then down to his stomach and across his shoulders, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The beast then seemed to let out a slight chuckle. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Astounded by the sight, I stood to my feet and dropped the glass wine bottle, which shattered into pieces and spilled out onto the forest floor. "Greetings. Do you like this shape?" the Sasquatch asked in a low, eerie tone. The Sasquatch tilted its head sideways as it looked at me. Despite my best efforts, I was stunned silent and could make no reply. "Don't you recognize me? I'm what they're all chasing after. I make the knocking noises heard in the distance," the Sasquatch said. The creature then began to laugh heartily at my frightened and confused expression. The Sasquatch walked around me as it continued to look at me. It was almost dancing in its graceful motion. "Perhaps you'd like this one," it said as it suddenly began once more to transform. The creature levitated into the air, and a purple light emanated from its body as the figure became that of a beautiful goddess. It was Athena, whom I had worshipped before. She was holding her spear and shield. An owl was perched on her shoulder. A sudden sense of awe and religious ecstasy hit me. I was overcome with emotion. "Lift your eyes up to me. Follow her," she said in a commanding and queenly tone. She extended a hand to me and caressed my face the way a mother might lovingly caress her child. I briefly felt my face go numb as she touched me. It felt somehow more real than real. It's hard to explain. It's like in that moment I realized that I wasn't real, and neither was the world around me. But she was. I'd never experienced anything like it before. "You are in my care. You are in my guidance. You have nothing to fear," the goddess said. Every word she spoke I could feel deeply. I had an intense sense of knowing them to be true, a profound sense that I should trust her. I could feel that this entity embodied pure goodness, love, wisdom, and truth. My mind was buzzing. The goddess before me began to shift rapidly. The next thing I knew, she appeared to be the goddess Inanna or Ishtar, then Aphrodite or Venus, then Isis, then Brigid, then Athena again. The shapes moved so quickly that I lost track completely. "I've seen you there, at your altar, in the dark by candlelight. All those little statues you collect, just more and more of my faces." Her arms then went out in the cruciform pose, and in a flash of a blindingly bright light, she was gone, now replaced by a new form. There stood a scrawny tan outsider in ragged off-white clothing. His robes began to glow whiter than anyone could bleach them, and a familiar feeling came over me. "Hello, my child. Remember me?" Now I felt like I was 5 years old again. In those Sunday school lectures I soon grew to despise. "You don't hate me now, do you?" he said with a half-smile. Christ's face then started to warp and change until it was unrecognizable. It cycled through various faces like you'd see in any given crowd, until it seemed to melt and distort into a disturbing mess of features. The being laughed mischievously. "See, isn't this fun? I can make you believe every word. I'm pretty good at this. I've been doing it for a very long time." The creature was mocking me. None of that was real, but it had all felt so real. I can get scary too. Just you wait. Suddenly horns sprouted out from Christ's head. A devilish expression took over his face, distorting his caring eyes into a wicked stare and an evil grin. His skin became deep red and his eyes became a charcoal black. Large, dark bat wings extruded from his back, and cloven hooves took the place of his nail-pierced feet. His voice grew deeper as he laughed once again. Every good performer has to play a villain sometimes. A sudden intense feeling that something was horribly wrong came over me. I sensed imminent death. All my hair stood on end. I had the primal feeling of fight, flight, or freeze, so I just stood there frozen still. Once again, I felt the feeling that I somehow knew this being to be pure evil. The only problem was that before I somehow knew it to be pure good. How, I thought, could my perception be fooled like this so deeply? This being seemed to have complete control and command over my emotions and my senses. There was no discerning the truth beyond these intense experiences. Finally, I managed to speak a single sentence aloud. "What are you?" I said with a look of disgust. There aren't good enough words for what I am. I've been fooling humanity since the dawn of society. I ruled Mesopotamia. The Egyptians once carved guises for me and bowed before them. I commanded a civilization from Mount Olympus in many forms. I guided Zoroaster and countless other philosophers and mystics. I told Abraham, "If you'll be my people, I'll be your God." So he took that deal. I came to Paul on the road to Damascus as a dead man's apparition and changed his mind. Soon much of the world had entered into my new blood covenant. Those are only a few examples you'd be familiar with. I can't even begin to tell you all the eyes I've pulled the wool over. Why? I asked. Why bother tricking humanity? Human beings have the capacity to imagine, to create cultural structures with me that I can use to influence you. A wolf cannot build a temple to Aphrodite and cannot imagine her form. To use the human mind to establish and perpetuate these customs, traditions, and images by which to control mankind, that is my goal. More accurately, that is my means to an end I can't reveal to you at this time, but that which is mankind's ultimate destiny. I am the ghost of every ghost tale, the chill down your spine when you enter a haunted house, just as much as I am the feeling of the divine in every place of worship. Despite any appearance I may take, I am not your dead loved ones. I simply embody a memory to deceive and manipulate. In this sense, I am everyone's dead loved ones. I'm your friend, your father, your mother. I'm your deity. I'm everyone's deity. I am the UFO of every UFO sighting, the creature of every fairy tale. I have taken you to the fairy realm, to outer space, to anywhere your mind has wanted to go. All I ask for in return is your belief, your faith, and ultimate ownership of your species. I'm not human. I don't have any morality. That's a game your species has invented. I've watched countless civilizations come and go. I watch human lives twinkle in and out of existence like blinking lights. Sometimes I play you against each other. Your species is a plant that I water with deception until the day that it has fully grown for its greater purpose, for its apotheosis. It's fitting that some people these days call me their shepherd. To me, you are property. I collapsed to my knees, overwhelmed by it all. I started crying and sobbing. Thank you for the offering. I hope I've answered your questions to the best of my ability. Tell your mother to keep praying those prayers. It feeds us. With that, the creature vanished right before me. Perhaps, I thought, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing us that we had a choice, or that there was an alternative. But what I saw wasn't the devil. That's just one name from one version of one story. There was no true word for what it was. An intelligence with a million names has no true name, and a consciousness with a million faces has no true face. After taking quite a while to compose myself, I left the forest and returned to my aunt's home. In the morning, my aunt's condition took a turn for the worse. We had a little heart-to-heart, and I told her that despite whatever differences we'd had, I truly loved her. We sat in silence for a while after that. Throughout our conversation, she appeared to be in horrible pain and barely hanging on. Then, suddenly, a peaceful expression went across my aunt's face and she smiled. I feel a bit better. There's someone else in the room with us, she said, looking to the corner as if she was seeing something. I turned but saw nothing. Who is it? I asked with hesitation. It's Jesus, she said happily. A chill went down my spine. Hours later, she slipped away, and I wept bitterly. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.